What if the Inca Empire repelled the Spanish? What if, in the high Andes under the shadow of snow-capped peaks, the jagged thread of history had twisted, just slightly? What if the Inca, defiant in the face of cannon smoke and steel blades, had turned the tide? If the empire of Tawantinsuyu had not crumbled beneath Spanish boots, but instead held its ground, what kind of world would we have inherited? To understand this fork in time, we must first return to the final days of a civilization on the edge. It is November 1532. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, a man of ambition wrapped in steel and desperation, have arrived on Peruvian shores. They are but 168 men, a handful of horses, and a hunger for gold that burns brighter than the sun overhead. They descend into Cajamarca, a town nestled high in the Andes, where the Sapa Inca Atahualpa has just emerged victorious from a brutal civil war against his half-brother Huáscar. The empire is wounded, divided, but still vast, stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Roads thread mountains, stone cities gleam in the sunlight, and at the center is a belief, not in conquest, but in cosmic order, in the divine right of the Sapa Inca to rule all things beneath Inti, the sun. In our timeline, Pizarro's ambush in Cajamarca was swift and brutal. Atahualpa was captured, his entourage slaughtered, and the empire spiraled into chaos. The Spanish used native allies, disease, and ruthless strategy to dismantle what had taken centuries to build. But in this alternate world, the meeting in Cajamarca unfolds differently. A single moment, the flutter of a butterfly's wings, shifts the course of history. Atahualpa, wary from the war with Huáscar and aware of rumors swirling about these pale-skinned invaders, decides not to enter Cajamarca unarmed. Instead, he sends emissaries to gauge the Spanish. His generals, Rumiñahui, Quisquis, and Titu Atauchi, counsel caution. The Sapa Inca listens, and when the trap is sprung, the Spanish find not an emperor carried on a litter, but a line of battle-hardened warriors, armed with slings, clubs, and spears tipped with sharpened obsidian. The Spaniards fire their arquebuses. Horses charge. But this time, the trap is a trap within a trap. Hidden Inca forces descend from the hills. Bolas whirl through the air. Slingstones crack helmets. Horses panic. The narrow mountain passes become death funnels. The Spanish are outnumbered 100 to 1. By dawn, the streets of Cajamarca run red. But not with Inca blood. Pizarro is dead, Atahualpa is triumphant, and the age of the Inca has not ended, but begun anew. And yet, in the glow of victory, new threats emerge, because Spain is not a single man with a sword, but an empire of oceans and ambitions. Word will reach Panama, and the war for the New World has only just begun. The sun rose slowly over Cajamarca, casting a golden light on the broken lances, shattered steel, and the blood-soaked banners of the fallen Spaniards. Where once the conquerors had prepared to seize an empire, now their lifeless bodies lay strewn across the plaza. Pizarro's ambition ended not with a crown, but with a slingstone to the skull, his corpse unrecognized by the very world he sought to remake. For Atahualpa, this was not only a victory, it was a warning from the gods. Viracocha had spared his people, but the message was clear. The invaders would come again. The Sapa Inca, still standing amidst the scent of fire and death, knew the future now ran along a different path, one carved by vigilance, reform, and war. With the Spanish column annihilated, the Inca wasted no time. Survivors, few and terrified, were captured. Among them were interpreters, scribes, and a priest clutching a crucifix like a blade. From these captives, Atahualpa learned everything. That the Spanish were not merely pirates or wandering soldiers, but envoys of a vast empire across the sea, one ruled by a Christian king and fed by conquest, that more ships would come, that what had arrived at Cajamarca was not an end, but a beginning. The Sapa Inca summoned his greatest minds. Quipucamayos, the keepers of the knotted cords of history, began recording every detail of the Spanish language, their weapons, their beliefs. Captured steel was melted and studied. Horses, once mistaken for gods, were broken and trained. Arquebuses were disassembled, and black powder analyzed by metallurgists from Cusco and Colosio. But while knowledge grew, the real transformation came through blood and unity. Atahualpa understood the fragility of an empire born of conquest. The scars of the Civil War had not faded. Resentment festered in the southern provinces. So the Sapa Inca did what no Inca before him had dared. He called for reform. Rather than punishing the partisans of Huascar, he invited their leaders into his new council. He offered amnesty in exchange for fealty, not to him, but to the survival of Tawantinsuyu itself. The empire, he proclaimed, was no longer just the divine reflection of the sun. It was a fortress of all its peoples, bound together not by fear, but by the looming threat of annihilation. Missions were dispatched to the edge of the empire, spreading tales of the pale-skinned gods that bled like men. Fortresses were reinforced from Quito to Lake Titicaca. Roads were widened to move armies faster than ever. The Chasqui messengers ran day and night, their footsteps stitching the empire tighter with every heartbeat. And in secret, the Inca began to prepare their greatest gamble, one that would carry them beyond their mountains and into the unknown. On the shores of Tumbes, where Spanish ships once anchored, the Inca began constructing vessels of their own. Inspired by tales from the captives and their crude maps, shipwrights from the Chincha culture, masters of Pacific navigation, were summoned. Balsa wood rafts gave way to larger, sturdier ships, reinforced with captured iron. They would not wait for the next Spanish fleet to arrive. They would meet it. But across the sea, in the viceroyalty of New Spain, the story of Pizarro's death spread like wildfire. Panic, disbelief, then fury gripped Lima and Panama. The King of Spain was informed. Preparations began. A crusade was called, not just of arms, but of faith. The next fleet would be larger, more ruthless, backed by the full weight of Spanish vengeance. But this time, the Inca would not be caught off guard. As Atahualpa stood atop the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, gazing toward the Pacific, he saw not the edge of his world, but its future. The battle for Tawantinsuyu had begun, and for the first time, it would not be fought on Inca soil alone. The empire would strike first. The Pacific shimmered beneath a winter sun, its vastness once a barrier, now a bridge. On the shores of Tumbes, what had once been a sleepy coastal outpost transformed into the empire's most ambitious frontier. Thousands of workers labored under the watch of engineers and priests, weaving rope, forging nails, and hauling timber. The Inca, a people of mountain roads and highland stone, were now becoming shipwrights. The ships they built were unlike the Spanish caravels, no high sterns or deep keels, but they were swift, stable, and adaptable. Drawing from Chincha maritime tradition and observation of the Spanish hulls, the Inca developed hybrid vessels, balsa rafts rigged with canvas sails, reinforced with copper-clad ribs, and fitted with rudimentary decks. They couldn't yet match the transoceanic capabilities of European galleons, but they didn't need to. Not yet. Their objective wasn't to sail for Spain, it was to secure the Pacific coast. As this naval renaissance unfolded, the Inca intelligence network stretched outward like veins from a beating heart. Captured Spanish documents were studied meticulously. From the mouths of trembling prisoners came the names of cities: Panama, Lima, Veracruz, and even more ominously, Mexico, where another indigenous empire had fallen under the same storm of steel and cross. The fate of the Aztecs became a cautionary tale, a grim mirror. But it also revealed the Spanish vulnerabilities: overextension, disease, reliance on native allies, and blind arrogance. Atahualpa, never again trusting the divine to save his people, established the Yashai Wasi, houses of knowledge, in major cities. There, captured knowledge was translated, weaponized. The empire's finest minds, once scholars of astronomy and irrigation, now turned their talents to chemistry, metallurgy, and logistics. Black powder was their obsession. Within a year, crude Inca forges began producing limited quantities of gunpowder, less refined than Spanish stock, but functional. Cannons were still beyond reach, but portable weapons like fire lances and hand cannons emerged, clumsy but deadly. Their use was restricted to elite units trained in new formations, mimicking the terrifying thunder tactics of the Spanish conquistadors. Yet Atahualpa knew weapons alone would not be enough. Tawantinsuyu would not survive by standing still, and so he turned outward, toward the one force that had nearly doomed the empire from within, its neighbors. In this new world, the Inca would need alliances, not just vassals. Messengers were sent to the Mapuche to the south, who had resisted Inca expansion for decades. Envoys traveled north into the lands of the Muisca and Chachapoya, bearing not threats, but gifts: steel blades, textiles, promises of defense against the ghostly tide from across the sea. Old enemies became uneasy partners, bound by a shared dread of foreign domination. But not all were eager. In many corners of the Andes, resentment toward Inca rule still burned. And in the lowlands and jungle frontiers, rumors swirled that not all Spanish had been destroyed. Some had fled south and east, into the wilderness, forging alliances of their own. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Spanish crown reacted as expected. The failure of Pizarro was not treated as a minor loss. It was an affront to the very soul of the Spanish Empire. A holy mission, blessed by the Pope, had ended in disaster. That a heathen king had slain a royal envoy and wiped out an entire company of conquistadors was unthinkable. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was incensed. He summoned his generals, ordered new fleets to be assembled, and granted unprecedented authority to one man, Hernando de Soto, a veteran of Peru and former companion of Pizarro. Where Pizarro had failed through deception and delay, de Soto would succeed through overwhelming force. A fleet of over 2,000 men was raised in Seville. Experienced soldiers, hardened by the Reconquista and campaigns in the Caribbean. Ships were armed with cannons and loaded with horses, arquebuses, steel breastplates, and, perhaps most deadly of all, priests carrying crosses and mandates of forced conversion. By 1535, the fleet set sail from Panama, charting the same waters Pizarro once crossed. But this time, they would not find an unprepared empire. Atahualpa, from his mountain citadel, received news of sails on the horizon. The second wave had come. The war for the New World was about to erupt in full. And this time, the Inca would meet their invaders not as victims, but as equals on the battlefield. The sky above the coast of Tumbes turned black with storm clouds and sails alike. In June of 1535, the Spanish fleet under Hernando de Soto loomed over the Pacific like an iron tide. 30 ships, hundreds of horses, thousands of soldiers, and behind them, the weight of an empire that had devoured civilizations. But this time, the conquistadors faced something they had never encountered before. An empire not falling, but rising. Not fractured, but focused. De Soto was no fool. He had survived the jungles of Nicaragua, the chaos of Pizarro's first expedition, and the whispers of mutiny in the Caribbean. He expected a quick strike, a replay of Tenochtitlan, or perhaps even Pizarro's ambush in Cajamarca. But what he found when his men landed was something that chilled even his seasoned bones. An empire that had studied his people, prepared for them, and evolved. The beaches of northern Peru were no longer soft landing grounds. They were death traps. The Inca, using tactics learned from both their own highland warfare and careful observation of Spanish maneuvers, constructed layered defenses. Ditches, pike traps, elevated slingstone positions, and black powder ambush points. When the first Spanish vanguard disembarked near the port of Paita, they were met not with submission, but a coordinated counterattack. Atahualpa had entrusted command of the coast to Ruminui, once a general of the Civil War, now a patriot hardened by the threat of extinction. Under his leadership, the Inca developed what modern minds might call hybrid warfare, merging native mobility and terrain mastery with stolen Spanish firepower and brutal discipline. Slings rained down from hidden ridges. Bolas snapped legs and tendons. When the Spanish pushed inland with cavalry, they were funneled into false valleys lined with bamboo stakes and incendiary traps. Arquebuses thundered, but for every Inca who fell, two more emerged from behind stone barricades, wielding obsidian-tipped pikes and spears. What stunned De Soto most, however, wasn't the resistance. It was the coordination. Messages seemed to travel faster than his scouts. Ambushes were prepared before his advance was even known. His horses, his greatest weapon, were terrified by whistles, firebombs, and spike mats laid in clever formation. He realized too late. The Inca had turned their entire empire into a fortress. Unable to secure a foothold, De Soto ordered his troops to fortify a beachhead and regroup. But food was scarce, the heat oppressive, and morale crumbling. Local tribes, once expected to rebel against Inca authority, instead struck at the Spanish supply lines, motivated not by love for the Sapa Inca, but hatred of foreign invaders who brought disease, slavery, and flame. It was then that the second phase of Atahualpa's plan began. Far to the south, near the port of Arica, a second Inca fleet, smaller, faster, landed behind enemy lines. They carried no army. Instead, they carried fire. Saboteurs, trained in Spanish methods and armed with stolen powder kegs, slipped into the rear camps of the invaders. They ignited stores of food, poisoned wells, and incited local uprisings. One bold raid even managed to torch a Spanish galleon moored in shallow waters, an act that spread terror through the fleet. The myth of Spanish invincibility was unraveling. Back in Cusco, Atahualpa knew the war was far from over. He had won battles, not the war. But each Spanish loss was a message sent across the Andes and beyond. The tide had shifted. For the first time in the age of conquest, a native empire had not only survived the arrival of Europe, but had struck back. The implications rippled beyond Peru. In the jungles of Brazil, Portuguese slavers began to rethink their inland advances. In New Spain, whispers spread among the Nahua and Maya. If the Inca could resist, could they? Even in the court of Charles V, uncertainty began to cloud confidence. But De Soto was not done. Retreating was not an option. Honor, vengeance, and holy mission bound him. So he did what all desperate commanders do. He planned a march on Cusco itself. If he could reach the heart of the empire and strike it down, perhaps the serpent would die with its head. And so, through the jungle-choked valleys of the Andes, with dwindling men and dying horses, De Soto began the long climb toward the city of the sun. Ahead lay ambushes, betrayal, frost, and fire. And at the end of the path, the Sapa Inca waited, not as prey, but as predator. The Andes loomed like the spines of a sleeping god, silent, eternal, merciless. For Hernando de Soto and the remnants of his army, the march toward Cusco was no longer a campaign. It was a slow unraveling of men, morale, and meaning. From the humid coast near Paita, De Soto had gathered what strength remained of his expedition. Just over 1,000 to 200 soldiers, their faces gaunt from hunger, their armor rusting in the relentless rains. Dozens of horses had already perished, their corpses lining the narrow trails. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged ravines, high passes slick with snow, paths barely wide enough for a man, let alone a column of war. But worse than nature was the enemy they could not see. Atahualpa had unleashed a shadow war. The Inca had mastered the art of the land. Every valley held hidden scouts. Every river crossing, a potential trap. Chasqui messengers relayed Spanish movements faster than De Soto's own couriers. Supplies vanished mysteriously in the night, and when the Spaniards camped, they found themselves surrounded by silence, too complete to be natural. Then came the attacks, small, surgical, and cruelly precise. A dozen warriors would emerge from the fog, strike, and vanish. They set fires, cut throats, released horses, poisoned food. They seemed to move with the mountains, and for the first time, the conquistadors began to fear not defeat, but vanishing, one by one, swallowed by a landscape that did not want them. Morale collapsed. Some of the native auxiliaries, men from the Caribbean or Mesoamerica forced into Spanish ranks, began to desert. A few even defected, offering their knowledge of Spanish tactics to Inca commanders in exchange for sanctuary. De Soto responded with brutal executions, but every hanging only deepened the dread. The air grew thinner, and so did his grip on command. Meanwhile, in Cusco, Atahualpa prepared not merely for defense, but for spectacle. The Sapa Inca understood that this war would not be won only by blades. It would be won by myth, by memory. The Spanish had come expecting gold and weakness. He would give them thunder and eternity. He ordered great drums carved from stone to be placed around the capital. Bonfires were prepared on high ridges to signal the beginning of the final confrontation. He dressed his warriors not in crude armor, but in ceremonial garb, dyed crimson and black, colors of death and rebirth. The city itself had been fortified beyond its ancient walls. Engineers had constructed layers of stone barricades, narrow kill zones, and pathways designed to funnel invaders into death traps. Slingers took positions above rooftops. Archers, armed with newly crafted bows inspired by Spanish crossbows, were hidden behind false walls. Even children were trained as runners, relaying orders beneath the city's labyrinth of aqueducts and tunnels. As De Soto's army crested the final ridge, they saw Cusco, gleaming in the Andean light, unburned, unbroken. The sight should have inspired confidence. Instead, it chilled them. Because it meant the city had not fallen. It was waiting. The Spanish had one advantage left: desperation. De Soto ordered an all-out assault, throwing every able-bodied man into the fray. With war cries and the boom of arquebuses, they charged through the terraces. For a moment, it seemed the Spanish might break through. But then came the sound, a deep, rhythmic pounding. The stone drums began to echo across the valley. From the hills, fires flared to life in synchronized waves. It was not a call to arms. It was a funeral rite for the invaders. The ground itself seemed to respond. Inca warriors, in perfect formations, surged like rivers around the Spanish flanks. Hidden pits opened beneath charging cavalry. Fire lances burst from rooftops, showering sparks on panicked troops. Horses slipped and broke legs on greased stones. Arquebusiers, out of powder and cornered, tried to fight with swords, only to be dragged into alleys and vanish beneath clubs and spears. Still, the Spanish fought on. De Soto, bloodied and furious, led a charge into the heart of the city, determined to find and kill Atahualpa with his own blade. He reached the steps of the Temple of the Sun, where the Sapa Inca stood, unmoving, a golden headdress blazing in the torchlight. The two locked eyes. In that moment, neither was a god. Just two men, shaped by different continents, forged by war. De Soto raised his sword, but before he could strike, a spear pierced his side, hurled by a teenage warrior from the highlands. De Soto collapsed to his knees, coughing blood. His sword fell. The boy, nameless to history, became the spark that ended the last hope of Spanish conquest in the Andes. As dawn broke over Cusco, silence returned. The city stood untouched. The invaders were gone, and the world was about to feel the tremor of a new future, one in which the Inca did not fall, but rose. The smoke of battle had not yet faded when the Inca banners were raised across every tower of Cusco, their brilliant gold and deep crimson catching the light of a triumphant sun. For the first time in living memory, the heart of Tawantinsuyu beat not with fear or fractured pride, but with clarity. The gods had spoken, through blood, through fire, and through will. Atahualpa did not celebrate. He stood at the summit of Sacsayhuaman, the fortress overlooking the sacred city, not as a victor, but as a steward of something fragile: survival. He knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. For the world beyond the Andes would not sit idle. The Spanish, humiliated in front of all Christendom, would not forget this wound. Already, whispers spoke of new armadas being prepared in Seville, of papal bulls condemning the Inca as heretics and heathens, and worse still, the diseases the invaders carried, pox, fever, influenza, had already seeped into coastal villages, beyond the reach of slings and spears. So the Sapa Inca turned inward. The empire had won a war, but now it needed to win a future. He summoned the Council of Four Suyus, leaders from each corner of Tawantinsuyu, Chinchaisuyu, Antisuyu, Kulasuyu, and Kuntisuyu. Never before had the empire operated as a true federation. But now, Atahualpa proposed something radical: shared governance. Not the dissolution of power, but the multiplication of strength. Each Suyu would maintain autonomy over its internal matters, but all would contribute to a new central council of statecraft, warfare, science, and diplomacy. Quipus, once tools of record-keeping, became instruments of correspondence. A written script, inspired by captured Spanish texts, was developed, a hybrid syllabary infused with Quechua and Andean symbolism. Literacy, once reserved for elites, began to spread. With new knowledge came new horizons. Captured Spanish shipwrights were not executed, they were employed. Under supervision, they taught Inca builders the secrets of open ocean navigation. Timber was harvested from the highland forests. Copper nails replaced lashing fiber. Before long, the Inca navy was no longer confined to coastal rafts. Prototypes of caravel-like vessels, reinforced with bronze fittings and rigged with triangular sails, took shape in dry docks from Tumbes to Arequipa. And then came the most controversial idea of all: diplomacy. Atahualpa dispatched an envoy, not to Spain, but to the other peoples of the Americas. Messengers traveled north to the remnants of the Aztec world, where the Mexica survivors still lived under Spanish rule in the ashes of Tenochtitlan. Another envoy crossed the mountains into the Amazon basin, reaching out to the countless tribes who had never bent to empire, Inca or Spanish. What they carried was not just a message, it was a vision, a pact of native solidarity, a hemisphere not defined by conquest and empire, but by resistance and shared survival. The response was mixed. Some tribes remained wary, others intrigued. But in the shattered heart of New Spain, among Nahua leaders tired of slavery and crucifixion, the idea burned like dry grass under lightning. Rebellion was no longer an act of desperation, it was a possibility. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe stirred. The Spanish crown, licking its wounds, redirected its colonial focus toward the Caribbean and Mexico. Advisors cautioned against another Peruvian disaster. The Pope, humiliated by the Inca victory, demanded conversion by any means necessary. But few ships now dared to land on Andean shores. Portugal, Spain's maritime rival, saw opportunity. Lisbon sent its own envoys, less pious, more pragmatic. They approached the empire not with swords, but with trade. They offered spices, navigational charts, gunpowder refinement techniques, in exchange for gold, silver, and access to Andean ports. The Inca, wary but curious, agreed to controlled exchanges in neutral zones, and so, for the first time in human history, the Andes became a global actor, not a land to be plundered, but a nation to be negotiated with. Back in Cusco, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. Inca youths studied astronomy with European star maps. Blacksmiths forged guns alongside ceremonial axes. Temples stood beside academies. The line between sacred and scientific blurred. And yet, Atahualpa felt the weight of time pressing on him. He had once been a prince in a divided land. Now he was the architect of a new age. But even as the empire flourished, his greatest challenge lay ahead. Not in war, but in what came after. Because power, once shared, is difficult to hold. And unity, once inspired by fear, must be maintained by purpose. As the empire expanded its influence, cracks began to form in its foundation, not of stone, but of ideology. And far to the north, a message arrived that would force the Inca to confront a new reality. The Mexica had risen. Not alone, but with help. The message arrived under heavy guard, carried not by a Chasqui runner, but by a delegation of Nahua dignitaries cloaked in obsidian-dyed cotton and feathers of the quetzal. They had traveled for months through jungle, over mountains, across rivers and enemy lines, not just to bring news, but to request something that had not been spoken aloud in over a decade. Alliance. Tenochtitlan had fallen in 1521. Its temples burned, its canals clogged with blood. The Mexica, once rulers of a mighty Triple Alliance, had been crushed beneath the weight of Spanish steel and Tlaxcalan betrayal. But the fire of resistance never died. Beneath the viceroy's palace, in hidden rooms and broken barrios, Nahua scribes preserved the codices. Priests remembered the rites. Warriors trained in secret. Their obsidian blades sharpened not for tribute, but for revenge. And now, the impossible had happened. Inspired by tales of the Inca victory, stories smuggled north by traders, escaped slaves, and defected soldiers, the Nahua resistance had launched a coordinated uprising. In a single night of fire and fury, Spanish garrisons across the Valley of Mexico were attacked. Powder stores exploded. Bridges collapsed. Missionaries disappeared into the jungle. The viceroy barely escaped with his life. And in the chaos, a name began to spread. Tecutli Iztacoatl, a descendant of the royal line, had declared the Mexica free and sovereign once more. But he knew the victory would be short-lived unless it was reinforced. Hence, the delegation to Cusco. When they arrived at Atahualpa's court, they did not kneel. They stood as equals, once conquered peoples now bound not by past glory, but by shared struggle. Their proposal was simple, yet audacious: a pan-indigenous confederation stretching from the Andes to the Valley of Mexico. A new alliance to drive out the European invaders, not as separate rebellions, but as a united front. Atahualpa listened carefully. He was no longer the brash emperor of Cajamarca, but a seasoned ruler tempered by war and diplomacy. He knew unity was power, but also risk. The Mexica were fierce, proud, and once imperial in their own right. Would this be a partnership or a clash of egos disguised as cooperation? Still, he saw the wisdom in it. The Spanish could always send more ships. The Portuguese, though friendly now, were not to be trusted. And beyond them loomed other European powers: the French, the English, the Dutch, predators circling the wounded body of the New World. The decision was made. In a ceremony unlike any before, Atahualpa and Iztacoatl met on neutral ground, a stone plateau near Lake Titicaca, the sacred center of Andean cosmology. There, beneath a sky carved with stars, they pledged blood and alliance. The Treaty of Titicaca, as it would later be known, formed the spine of a new continental resistance, the Pact of the Sun and the Serpent. Military coordination began immediately. Inca engineers were dispatched north to help the Mexica rebuild their shattered aqueducts and fortifications. In return, Nahua metallurgists and herbalists brought new technologies, particularly in poisoncraft and obsidian weaponry. Trade routes were secured, running from the highlands of Peru to the jungles of Guatemala. And for the first time in centuries, knowledge flowed freely between empires that had once never met. But it wasn't just soldiers and diplomats who moved. Ideas did too. Nahua scribes studied the Inca quipu system, adapting it into hybrid codices that mixed knots with pictographs. Inca priests witnessed Nahua rituals of sacrifice and bloodletting, and many recoiled, while others saw echoes of their own past. Debates ignited in temples and academies. Could a shared religion be forged? A common language? A political framework that honored both worlds? The cultural fusion was messy, unpredictable, and often tense. But it moved. And while it did, Europe began to tremble. Reports reached Madrid that not one, but two native empires had not only survived, but joined forces. That Spanish colonies were falling, that entire fleets had vanished along the Pacific coast. The Spanish treasury, drained from wars in Europe and now starved of Andean silver, began to crack. In Seville, bankers panicked. In Rome, cardinals questioned the divine mandate of conquest. In Lisbon, Portuguese diplomats saw a narrowing window of opportunity and doubled down on their careful courtship of the Inca. And yet, in the shadow of all this progress, a new storm brewed. Because while the Inca and Mexica focused on unity, far to the east, beyond the Amazon, another force was stirring. Not Spanish, not Portuguese, but something new, something Protestant, something English, and they were not coming to convert, nor to trade. They were coming to colonize. The Atlantic winds carried more than just storm clouds, they bore the scent of ambition. In the year 1542, as Spain reeled and Portugal treaded carefully, a third shadow emerged on the horizon. The English. Unlike the Spaniards, who came cloaked in crosses and cloaked conquest as salvation, the English bore a different creed. Profit. Their monarch, Henry VIII now dead, had left behind a fracturing realm, torn between Catholic memory and Protestant future. But one vision remained clear. England, if it was to survive the continental powers, needed empire. And so, under Queen Mary, and later under the fiercely pragmatic Elizabeth I, English privateers and explorers sailed west, not toward the Caribbean alone, but south, around the Horn of Brazil, through the unknown waters of the Pacific, drawn by whispers of a native empire that had repelled even the Spaniards. Sir Francis Drake, a name history once remembered as corsair and explorer, now bore a new title, envoy. In this alternate age, Drake was dispatched not merely to raid, but to speak. His ship, the Golden Hind, slipped through Portuguese patrols and hugged the South American coast until it found a hidden inlet near the Inca port of Arequipa. The Inca, now well versed in European intentions, were not surprised. Atahualpa, older, wiser, surrounded by a court that now included not just generals and priests, but astronomers and foreign emissaries, received Drake in a hall carved from obsidian and gold. The Englishman, ever a performer, bowed low and presented gifts: fine woolen cloaks, barrels of black powder, and most importantly, books, texts of navigation, law, and science. What he offered was not religion nor domination, but knowledge, and a proposal, an alliance. England, he claimed, had no interest in the heavy-handed zealotry of Spain, nor in the cautious games of Portugal. Instead, they proposed mutual benefit: naval charts in exchange for gold, technology in exchange for territory access, and, most provocatively, military aid in exchange for exclusive trade. Atahualpa did not trust Drake, but he did respect the offer. The Council of Four debated for weeks. Some feared the English would simply replace one colonizer with another. Others saw an opportunity to play the European powers against one another, to fracture their unity and secure long-term autonomy. In the end, they agreed. But on Inca terms. England would be allowed a single port in the southern province of Culasuyu, near modern-day Chile, where they could build a trade outpost and dock ships under supervision. In return, the Inca would receive English muskets, gunpowder refinement techniques, and access to European markets, on the condition that no missionaries, settlers, or private military forces would accompany them. It was a gamble, but it worked. Within 2 years, the southern port of Talcahuasi became a hub of transoceanic trade. English merchants arrived not in armor, but in linen. They brought spices from Asia, textiles from Flanders, and mechanical devices unseen in the Andes: clocks, compasses, even crude printing presses. In turn, the Inca sold silver, gold, exotic herbs, and brilliantly woven textiles that astounded even the most jaded London merchant. But more than goods, the English brought ideas. One such idea was the notion of sovereignty not as divine right, but as legal contract. In Inca academies, translated fragments of English common law mingled with Andean legal traditions. Scholars debated in Quechua, Nahuatl, and now broken English. What emerged was a political philosophy rooted not only in kinship and celestial mandate, but in representation, law, and accountability. The Inca Confederation began to change. Local provinces were granted more say in central planning. Military governors were elected, not appointed. Even the priesthood saw reform, as astronomical knowledge began to reshape religious calendars. The sun was still sacred, but it now moved through heavens increasingly mapped by math, not myth. This transformation did not go unnoticed. Spain, alarmed by the growing influence of England in lands it once claimed, tried to retaliate. A fleet was dispatched from Panama to blockade Tacohassee, but it was intercepted, not by the Inca Navy alone, but by a joint fleet of Inca warships and English corsairs. The battle, fought in the cool mists of the southern Pacific, was swift and decisive. Spanish galleons, slow and overburdened, were routed by faster Inca English vessels, armed with new cannon placements and coordinated tactics. The Battle of Aymara Cove, as it came to be known, marked the end of Spanish maritime supremacy along the western coast of the Americas, and with it, a new chapter began. Inca ships, no longer confined to coastal patrols, began to cross the Pacific in earnest. They reached the islands of Polynesia, the spice ports of Indonesia, and, by 1560, even the edges of Ming China. There, they found a civilization as ancient as their own, equally proud, equally guarded. Trade began cautiously, then eagerly. Silk entered Cusco. Llamas were seen in Macau. A global network had begun to form, not one defined by Europe, but shaped by native agency, diplomacy, and ingenuity. But not all within Tawantinsuyu celebrated this new era. Some feared the loss of identity. Others bristled at foreign ships in sacred ports. And, in the far reaches of the Amazon and southern deserts, old enemies plotted. Because in every empire, no matter how enlightened, the seeds of rebellion never truly vanish. And now, one such seed was about to bloom, with fire. The empire of Tawantinsuyu, once a kingdom of stone and sky, had become a crucible of transformation. Gold flowed through Cusco not merely as tribute, but as currency. Books written in 3 languages, Quechua, Nahuatl, and a creolized English, circulated among temples and universities. Steam distillers bubbled in jungle outposts, refining quinine and dyes for export. From the peaks of the Andes to the waves of the Pacific, the Inca stood not as relics of a pre-modern world, but as architects of something new. But beneath the gilded brilliance of progress, fault lines deepened. Far from the palaces of Cusco and the bustling ports of Tacohassee, voices began to whisper. In the shadowed valleys of Antisuyu and the borderlands of the Amazon, not all subjects welcomed this new cosmopolitan empire. Many remembered the Civil War, the brutal consolidation of the highlands, and the forced labor systems that persisted under new names. The victories against Spain had not erased old resentments. They had simply buried them under layers of diplomacy and gold. In the jungle, a name began to circulate in hushed tones. Ilapa Titu, the thunder that returns. He was once a general, now a ghost. A descendant of the Chachapoya elite, a people long folded into the empire's edge, Ilapa Titu had fought in the coastal wars against De Soto's invasion. He had bled for Tawantinsuyu. But when the war ended and the gold began to flow, his homeland remained impoverished, its forests cut for ship timber, its rivers polluted by silver mining. His petitions to Cusco were ignored. His status revoked, so he disappeared. And in his absence, he built something dangerous. What began as a loose federation of disaffected warriors and exiles, Mapuche holdouts, Antisuyu villagers, runaway slaves, and even rogue Mexica soon evolved into a disciplined force. They called themselves the Sons of the Rainforest, and their goal was not reform, it was rupture. At first, their acts were symbolic. Sabotaged bridges, burned tax records, the occasional ambush of imperial caravans. But by 1562, their campaign escalated. A copper refinery in the east exploded in the night, killing dozens. A steam vessel carrying scholars to Titicaca was seized and scuttled. In the southern provinces, key water systems were poisoned, triggering panic and disease. Atahualpa, now in his late 60s, was no longer the young emperor of war. He had become something different, a symbol, a statesman, a living myth. But even he understood. Myth could not protect an empire from civil unrest. He summoned the 4 Suyus once more. The debate was bitter. Some urged immediate military retaliation, a purge of all suspected rebel zones, mass arrests, the closure of borders. Others, particularly from the Mexica delegation, advised caution. Hadn't rebellion once been their only means of freedom? Was violence the only answer to discontent? Atahualpa, remembering the ghost of his brother Huascar, sought a third path. He issued the Royal Declaration of Reciprocity, an unprecedented decree that required governors to implement rotating citizen councils in each province, giving communities limited say over resource extraction and taxation. The declaration also introduced term limits for provincial officials and began phasing out the old labor tribute system, the mita, that had long underpinned imperial industry. It was bold. It was progressive. And it was too late. Ilapatitu did not want reform. He wanted empire to end. His forces, now numbering in the tens of thousands, launched what would be remembered as the War of the Broken Cord. Their first target was the inland port city of Vilcabamba, a critical node in the jungle trade routes. It fell in 2 days. Then, in a coordinated wave, 6 other settlements across Antisuyu rose in revolt. The Inca military, modernized but still dependent on mountain warfare tactics, struggled in the dense, ever-shifting jungle. Firearms jammed. Roads turned to mud. Messaging faltered in the thick canopy. And Alapa's men fought like smoke, dispersing, reforming, striking from every direction. But this time, the Empire had allies. The Mexica, loyal to the pact, dispatched elite Jaguar warriors trained in guerrilla warfare. English shipwrights helped build shallow-draft river vessels to patrol the Amazon tributaries. And from the highlands came a new generation of Inca commanders, educated not only in war, but in strategy, science, and diplomacy. Among them was Mama Oclousu, granddaughter of Atahualpa. A tactician unlike any the Empire had seen, she understood that to defeat Ilapatitu, she had to fight not only in the jungle, but in the minds of the people. She led not just an army, but a narrative. She issued amnesties to rebel villages, redistributed captured trade goods, and broadcast her campaigns through roving troops of poets and performers who told stories of unity not as propaganda, but as identity. Within a year, the tide began to turn. One by one, Ilapa's outposts fell. His men, exhausted, fragmented. He fled deeper into the forest, where he vanished. His body never found, his legend absorbed by the land. The rebellion was crushed, but its lesson remained. Atahualpa did not gloat. In a speech delivered before the great plaza of Cusco, he said only this: "We have repelled the stranger, but can we repel ourselves?" That night, he walked alone beneath the stars. He was a man who had rewritten history. But history, like the mountains, does not sleep, and neither do its consequences. The mountains were silent that winter. Snow dusted the peaks above Cusco like the ash of old gods, and for the first time in decades, there was no sound of marching boots, no panicked cries, no distant drums. The Empire had endured invasions, survived plague, defied conquest, and withstood civil war. It had bent, but it had not broken. And now, as Atahualpa lay dying in his stone-walled chamber within the Temple of the Sun, a question echoed in every hall of power across Tawantinsuyu. What happens when the one who held it all together fades into myth? He had ruled for over 40 years, first by blood, then by fire, and finally by wisdom. The boy king who once rode a litter into Cajamarca had become the father of a civilization reborn. Under his reign, the Inca had not only repelled the Spanish, they had transformed, expanded, and stood toe-to-toe with Europe and Asia in the theater of empire. But now, the empire faced a different frontier: succession. Atahualpa had many children, many alliances. The bloodline was vast, the loyalties even wider. But he had no clear heir. Tradition dictated the next Sapa Inca be chosen by the Council of Four Suyus, with the blessing of the Sun priesthood. But tradition had bent under the weight of modernity. The Four Suyus now operated more like semi-autonomous republics. The priesthood had splintered into factions, some loyal to the old gods, others embracing astronomy, reason, and even fragments of Christianity imported by English reformists. And in the center of that tension stood a woman, Mama Oclo Seu, granddaughter of Atahualpa, hero of the Jungle War. Fluent in 3 languages, trained in both statecraft and warfare, she had the admiration of generals, the respect of the people, and the fear of the priesthood. A woman had never ruled as sole Sapa Inca, but the world had never been like this before. As Atahualpa's final breath escaped into the highland air, the empire stood at a precipice not of war but of evolution. The funeral lasted 7 days. Delegations from every corner of the Confederation arrived to pay respects. Mexican nobles in feathered cloaks, English merchants with somber letters of tribute, Polynesian navigators who had come to treat the Inca as equals in celestial cartography. On the 8th day, the council convened. What followed was not a coronation. It was something new. Mama Oclo Titu stood before the council in the Temple of Knowledge, no longer a place of sacrifice but of debate. She did not claim divinity. She did not raise her arms and call down the sun. Instead, she proposed a constitution. Written on bark paper in 3 scripts, it outlined a new structure: the dissolution of hereditary autocracy in favor of an elected triumvirate, each Suyu to nominate 1 voice. Together, they would rotate leadership, guided by a permanent chamber of scholars, judges, and engineers. The position of Sapa Inca would become ceremonial, a spiritual and cultural leader, elected for 10-year terms, open to any gender, lineage, or origin, so long as they swore loyalty to the principles of Tawantinsuyu, unity, reciprocity, and sovereignty. It was not met with universal praise. Some elders stormed out. Priests called it heresy, but others, especially those who had seen their villages rise under Mama Oclo's reforms, stood and clapped their hands in rhythm, a sound that grew, wave-like, until it filled the temple. The Constitution passed by a narrow vote, and in the spring of 1570, the first triumvirate was elected: Mama Oclo II from Chinchai Suyu, Tlakelo II from the Mexica Confederation, and Waman Tupac, a former rebel-turned-governor from Antisuyu. Together, they represented not the past, but the convergence of stories once thought impossible. Their first acts were sweeping. They abolished forced labor across the Confederation. They codified civil rights, including protections for minority tribes and religious groups. They opened new academies focused on medicine, cartography, and the sciences of navigation and metallurgy. And in a daring move, they funded an expedition eastward, across the Atlantic, not to invade, but to observe. 3 ships, each bearing the banner of the Sun and the Serpent, departed from Talcahuasi bound for Europe. Aboard them, scholars, diplomats, translators, and a small honor guard. Their mission: to learn, to study, to report. And what they found stunned them. Europe, once the untouchable Leviathan, was crumbling from within. Spain was bankrupt. The 30 Years' War simmered in the Holy Roman Empire. England, while growing in strength, was mired in religious tension and internal dissent. Portugal's colonial grip had weakened under Dutch pressure. Disease and famine had returned to the countryside. It was not a world of gods. It was a world of men, fractured, hungry, fragile. The Inca delegation returned with maps, instruments, and a single, astonishing conclusion. The empire they had built, blood-forged and storm-tested, was no longer a response to foreign invasion. It was the beginning of something far greater, a civilization that could outlive gods, kings, and time itself. In the wake of their return from Europe, the Inca delegation did not come home in awe, but with quiet certainty. The old world, which once loomed over them as an unstoppable colossus, had revealed itself to be mortal. Powerful, yes, but divided. Driven more by rivalry and dogma than wisdom or unity. And so, in the shadow of that revelation, the leaders of Tawantinsuyu gathered, not in Cusco, but in a new capital, Intipampa, Field of the Sun, a planned city built between the sacred lake of Titicaca and the old imperial roads. Intipampa was no fortress. It was a symbol. Wide boulevards stretched like rays from a central forum. Towers of polished stone and copper rose into the Andean sky. At its heart stood the House of Harmony, a circular chamber where the triumvirate met under a dome etched with both constellations and laws. It was here that the dream of a hemispheric civilization truly began to crystallize. Not one bound by bloodline or language, but by shared purpose. Under Mama Okalo Sekun and her fellow triumvirs, the Pact of the Sun and Serpent expanded into what modern history would later call the Concord of the Andes. It encompassed not just the Inca and Mexica, but dozens of smaller nations: Aymara, Muisca, Tupi, Carib, and Mapuche. Each retained cultural sovereignty, but contributed scholars, soldiers, and resources to the greater alliance. But the heart of this new order was not its armies. It was its schools. By 1580, more than 70 yachaywasi, houses of learning, dotted the continent. These were not merely places of rote knowledge, but centers of experimentation. Ideas flowed like water. Architecture from the Maya merged with Inca hydraulics. Mexica herbal medicine blended with Polynesian fermentation techniques. Early microscopes from England were improved with Andean crystal lenses. And then, in the highland town of Hatankampa, a breakthrough. An engineer named Korich Aska, Golden Star, devised a press that combined English mechanical design with Inca rotary motion principles. It could produce thousands of pages a day, even at high altitudes. The sun press was born, and with it, the age of print. Within a decade, the first continental journal was published, Pachacuti, or The Turning of the Earth. It carried political essays, scientific observations, agricultural reports, and poetry from across the Concord. For the first time in the Americas, ideas had velocity. Yet even as culture and science surged forward, the shadow of Europe had not vanished. In 1584, a Dutch flotilla attempted to seize a strategic trading port on the Pacific, seeking to disrupt the gold flow that had once fed Spain. They underestimated what the conquered had become. A combined naval force of Inca ironclads and Mexica boarding ships intercepted them at the Battle of Isla del Sol. The Dutch fleet was defeated, their flagship captured, and turned into a floating library, renamed Wilca Wira, Sacred Wind. The victory sent a clear message. The New World was no longer defenseless, but peace is not born from strength alone. It requires wisdom and vision. And so, the Concord turned its gaze not to war, but to the stars. In the deserts of Nazca, where ancient lines carved into earth pointed skyward, astronomers began work on the Hatun Yurak Apu, Great White Mountain, an observatory carved directly into a granite cliff. With lenses shipped from the coast and aligned to both Inca and Nahua calendars, it became the most advanced astronomical site in the hemisphere. From here, they charted Venus with mathematical precision. They tracked eclipses years in advance. And one cold night, under a moonless sky, they recorded a nova, a star that had not been there the night before. It was entered into the Pachacuti as a sign, but not of divine prophecy, of possibility. The empire that once worshipped the sun was now mapping its secrets, and in Intipampa, the council prepared for a new phase, external diplomacy. For years, the Concord had remained defensive, wary of deeper engagement with Europe beyond trade and observation. But now, embassies were dispatched to London, Amsterdam, Kyoto, and even Istanbul. These were not pleas for recognition, but invitations for dialogue. Not everyone welcomed them. In France, the idea of indigenous envoys receiving royal audiences sparked riots among Catholic hardliners. In Rome, the Pope denounced the Concord's religious pluralism as heretical pagan relativism. But in England and the Dutch Republic, curiosity overcame pride. Treaties were signed, scientific correspondence began. Ideas about democracy, separation of powers, and empirical logic flowed into the Americas, not as commandments, but as raw materials, and they were reshaped. The Concord scholars drafted the Kamachikui Rimaikuna, the words that govern, a codified framework blending native governance with philosophical imports. It outlined checks and balances, the rotation of leadership, and the rights of the governed to question authority, a concept once foreign, now fundamental. Mama Oklowikin, now nearing the twilight of her life, stood in the Hall of Harmony and read the final article aloud. No law shall bind the people which they cannot understand, and no ruler shall lead the people who does not listen. It was met with thunderous applause, but not all were clapping. Far beyond the Andes, across the Atlantic, new leaders had risen, empires forged in coal and cannon, and their ambitions would not be quiet forever. Already, rumors whispered of a new Spanish king, one with dreams of reclaiming the lost lands of the Indies. And in the north, strange sails had been seen off the coast of Vinland. The world was growing smaller, and the Concorde would soon face a new choice, whether to shield its golden age or carry it outward. The winds off the Pacific no longer whispered secrets, they carried them. By the year 1592, the continent once called a wilderness by European maps had become the center of a new geopolitical balance. Tawantinsuyu, now the beating heart of the Concorde of the Andes, stood not as an isolated miracle, but as the fulcrum of hemispheric civilization. Its cities shimmered with innovation, its fleets crossed oceans with confidence, and its scholars debated ethics and astronomy in temples reborn as universities. But with success came attention, and beyond the waves, new empires stirred. Spain had not forgotten. Though battered by decades of misfortune, revolts in the Netherlands, bankruptcy, and the slow rot of colonial overreach, it had found a new champion in King Philip III. Young, devout, and desperate to reclaim the glories of his grandfather Charles V, Philip announced a bold initiative, La Reconquista del Sol, the reclaiming of the sun. It was to be a holy war, masked in banners of piety, but driven by loss of wealth and pride. Intelligence gathered by Spanish agents, still operating in secret across former colonial ports, suggested the Concorde was growing not just powerful, but popular. Even some European philosophers began citing Inca texts as proof that civilization could arise without Christianity, without monarchy, without Europe. That Philip could not allow. And so, a new fleet was assembled in Cadiz. Not a mere expedition, but an armada of 20 ships, 3,000 men, and dozens of Jesuit missionaries. Their objective? Strike the Concorde's southern ports, sever its trade with England and Asia, and destabilize the fragile alliance from the edges inward. But once again, Spain underestimated what Tawantinsuyu had become. By now, the Inca navy had evolved into a formidable maritime force. Their largest vessels, known as Inti Warkis, Sons of the Sun, were hybrid warships, part Polynesian catamaran, part Dutch frigate, reinforced with local copper and designed for both speed and siege. More importantly, the Concorde had long abandoned the idea of fixed defense. They had moved to preemption. Before the Spanish fleet reached Chilean waters, it was intercepted by a coordinated force of Inca naval units, Mexica long-range fire platforms mounted on bamboo outriggers, and English privateers operating under the Concorde's flag. The battle, later known as the sinking at Arawi Bay, was not merely a rout. It was a demonstration. Spain had sent ships into what it thought was an ocean. They found a wall. Only 4 vessels limped back to the Atlantic, and one of them, boarded before escape, carried a letter written by a Concordan general addressed directly to King Philip. The sun rises for all who seek its warmth, but those who would steal it must learn to walk without shadows. The message was clear. The age of conquest was over. But even as threats from Europe receded, a new question emerged inside the Concorde itself. What now? They had defended their lands. They had built cities, rewritten laws, launched voyages, and mapped the stars. They had created something neither fully old nor entirely new. But for many in the younger generation, those born after the wars, raised in the era of exploration and integration, this success brought a strange tension. Was this the end of the story, or the beginning of another? In the Council of Intapampa, now a living parliament of over 200 delegates from across the hemisphere, Debate raged. Some argued for continental unification, one republic, many voices. Others insisted on maintaining the balance of the Confederation, protecting local autonomy over centralized ambition. Into this storm stepped the rising voice of Amaru Tupac, great-grandson of Atahualpa, son of a Nahua mother, raised between Cusco and Tenochtitlan. He was a poet, a diplomat, and a veteran of the eastern frontier. And he believed the Concorde's future did not lie in walls or fleets, but in knowledge. He proposed the greatest project in the history of the hemisphere, the Library of the Two Worlds. Built into a valley between Machu Picchu and Vilcabamba, the library would be a sanctuary of all human wisdom. Be Native, European, African, Asian. A living archive, open to all who sought understanding. It would preserve oral traditions and printed manuscripts, star charts and war journals, healing chants and mathematical formulas. The idea was radical, dangerous, beautiful, and it was approved. Construction began in 1597 by hand and by heart, stone by stone. It would take generations, but the first hall was opened in 1601, on the 100th anniversary of the death of the Old World's Columbus, and the symbolic birth of a new world made by those who had once been its victims. Amaru stood before the gathered scholars, surrounded by carved lintels bearing words from across languages: Quechua, Nahuatl, Arabic, Latin, Chinese. He said only, "We remember not because we fear forgetting, but because we choose to see." In that moment, the story of an empire that should have died in Cajamarca came full circle. It had survived disease, conquest, rebellion, and even itself. And it had emerged not as a footnote in someone else's history, but as the author of its own. What if the Inca Empire had repelled the Spanish? We have now imagined a world where that single twist of fate, one battle avoided, one trap reversed, rewrote centuries of colonial history. A world where native civilizations not only endured, but thrived. Where gold funded schools, not slaughter. Where diplomacy replaced domination. Where the Andes rose not as ruins, but as the cradle of a global power. Would you want to live in that world? Could such a civilization have endured the winds of modernity? Or would it too be swept away by the storms of history? Let us know in the comments. What do you think would have happened if the Inca had won? Would it change only the Americas or the world? Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and join the discussion below. Because sometimes asking what if is how we begin to understand what is.